This rich woman hired a housekeeper without knowing that it was her daughter that she had abandoned and that she thought was dead. In the beautiful neighborhoods of Abuja, where the roads are lined with trees and the walls of the villas as high as the secrets, lived a woman whom everyone spoke of with a mixture of admiration and fear. Madame Ioma Okori. It was said of her that she could transform a simple plot into an empire, that a word from her mouth was enough to make investors tremble. At the age of 50, she ran one of the largest real estate companies in the capital, and her name was synonymous with prestige, authority, and power. Always dressed with a mastered elegance, a tailor of creators, discreet perfume, refined jewelry, she embodied the dream of all these young women who hoped one day to succeed like her. But behind the perfect image, there was silence, a heavy, almost palpable silence which hovered over the impeccable corridors of her villa in Maitama. The housekeepers were afraid of her. They spoke in a low voice as soon as they heard the clacking of her heels on the marble. Everything had to be tidied up, precise. A spoon moved, a cushion misplaced, and her cold gaze was enough to freeze the blood. Even Grace, her personal assistant for more than 10 years, never allowed herself a word of excess. She knew the rules. With Madame Ioma, you had to obey, not argue. However, when night fell and the big house fell asleep, the woman of steel stopped playing her role. She went up to her dressing room, opened a hidden closet at the bottom, and took out a small silver box. Inside, a photo. A young man with a tender smile, holding in his arms a newborn nose. Ijeoma then sat down on a stool, stroking the image of the tip of her fingers and murmuring in a broken breath, "My baby, my little angel." It was the only moment when her voice trembled, when her eyes were eager to shed a tear. Then, as if she suddenly remembered who she was supposed to be, she closed the box, wiped her cheeks, and took on her marble mask. No one, not even Grace, knew who Ijeoma had carried a child with before. No one knew that she had lost him. She had buried everything, erased everything, but some memories refused to die. Every time she met a young woman with a baby in her arms, her heart tightened despite her. Every time an employee proudly showed her the picture of a newborn, she felt a familiar pain rise up from the bottom of her chest. She smiled politely, but her eyes faded immediately. One evening, as she was returning from a late meeting, her driver told her about his wife on the way to bed. He was moved, happy, full of hope. Ijeoma listened in silence, his gaze lost through the window. When he said, "I pray that God keeps the child in good health, madam," she simply replied, "Yes, that's all that matters." But at that precise moment, her heart was beating even faster. Returning home, she dined alone in the large living room lit by golden lamps. The house, so beautiful, suddenly seemed too big. She ate slowly, without really tasting. The tick-tack of the clock resonated in the room like a cruel reminder of the passing of time. Then, without warning, she put down her fork, got up, and went into her room. She opened the drawer of her nightstand, a small notebook yellowed by the years. On the first page, a date surrounded by red, May 12, 2001. Her fingers trembled. It was that day that she had lost everything. She could still see the hospital room, the pain, the suffocated screams. The voice of her mother, severe, ruthless. "This child is a shame for our family, Ijeoma. Forget him. Forget everything." And then this woman, a nurse, to whom the baby had been given, the fragile little body carried away. She wanted to run, to scream, but her legs had given in. Since that day, she had never been the same. The years had passed. Business had taken up all this space, and she had built an empire to no longer think of this void. But sometimes in the evening, alone on her terrace, she murmured, "If you were alive, you would be 23 today." The wind blew gently, moving the white curtains of her room, and in this light breath, she thought she heard a child laugh, a distant laugh, almost unreal. Then she closed her eyes, and for a few seconds she allowed herself to believe it. The rain fell that morning in Abuja, thin and persistent, drawing laughs on the windows of Ijeoma's big house. Grace, his assistant, walked quickly into the hall, holding a document shirt when she saw the governess chatting with a young girl near the door. "Madame, the new housemaid has arrived," the governess announced, leaning slightly. Ijeoma raised her computer's head. The young woman who was standing there seemed fragile, soaked to the shoulders, but straight, digny despite her simplicity. She wore a modest scarf, a worn dress, and held a small bag against her as if her whole life was in it. "Your name?" Ijeoma asked in a neutral tone. "Chidinma, madam," answered the young woman in a soft voice. She had an accent from the southeast, undoubtedly from a remote village. Her eyes, however, were neither shy nor fleeing. It was deep, calm, almost soothing. Grace looked discreetly at Ijeoma. She knew that Madame did not like girls too beautiful or too young in her staff, but this one revealed something else. No provocation, no flirtatiousness, just a strange tranquility. Ijeoma, after a long silence, closed her file and simply said, "Very well, the governess will explain the rules to you. I do not like noise or delays. Be respectful and work well. That's all." "Yes, madam. Thank you, madam," answered Chidinma, lowering her head. She was placed in the small room reserved for housekeepers, at the back of the villa. In the evening, she cleaned the kitchen, washed the dishes, tidied the dishes without complaining. The governess, intrigued by her discretion, sometimes looked at her through the door. This girl worked as if she already knew each corner of the house. Her gestures were precise, orderly, too much for a new arrival. The next day at dawn, Chidinma was already up. She was preparing breakfast, arranging the porcelain service on the large table in the living room. When Ijeoma entered, pulled with 4 pins as always, she noticed the perfect arrangement of the plates and the subtle smell of coffee. She looked up at the young girl who was standing, hands crossed. "Did you prepare this?" "Yes, madam." That's good." A rare approval. Even Grace, seeing her, she was surprised. The days passed and Chidinma took her place in the house. Always polite, always silent. She never seemed to make a mistake, never tired. But what troubled Ijeoma was this strange feeling, as if the presence of the young girl softened the air around her. When Chidinma entered the room, Ijeoma's heart calmed without her knowing why. Sometimes she looked at her from a long time, fascinated by her features, this soft face, this way of biting her lower lip when she thought. Everything seemed familiar to her. One evening, as she was working in her office, she heard a melody echoing in the kitchen, a soft, almost forgotten lullaby. The sound crossed the corridor and made Ijeoma tremble. It was this song, the one she sang 23 years ago to put her baby to sleep. She suddenly got up, her heart beating, and went to the door. Chidinma was washing dishes, carefree, always frowning. Ijeoma froze for a few seconds before asking, "Where did you learn this song?" The young girl turned around, surprised. "My mother sang it to me, madam." A heavy silence settled in. Ijeoma felt a wave of warmth rise to her chest, an emotion she tried to hide immediately. She nodded without saying anything and slowly left. But that night, she did not sleep. In her bed, the words of the young girl were spinning in her head. "My mother sang it to me." Impossible! And yet, something inside her murmured the opposite. The next day, she watched Chidinma from afar without showing herself. Every gesture, every look, every intonation seemed to remind her of someone. And the more she looked at her, the more a terrible question was inscribed in her mind. What if it wasn't a coincidence? The days passed slowly, like a tense thread between two worlds. The one of Ijeoma, built on control and silence, and the one that Chidinma seemed to lead with her, soft and discreet, but loaded with an old perfume. A perfume that the businesswoman could not name. Chidinma had adapted with an almost disturbing ease. In a few weeks, she knew the house better than any housewife before her. She knew what time Ijeoma liked to drink her coffee, how she stored her files, in what order she placed her jewelry in the dressing, and even the exact temperature she could stand in her room. She did not speak much, but she observed everything with a silent attention, almost as if she had already lived there. Ijeoma, who usually kept a close distance with her employees, was surprised to feel good in her presence. One morning, she surprised her while preparing breakfast with a delicacy that reminded her of the gestures of a mother with her child. She stood still for a few seconds, simply looking at her. She herself had never let anyone approach her so close to her domestic intimacy. But with Chidinma, the barriers seemed to crumble on their own. Little by little, she began to entrust her with tasks that no one had ever had. Tidy up her personal clothes, organize her parties, choose the jewelry she would wear for her important meetings. It was no longer just an employee, it was a presence, a soft and silent shadow in a house that had always been cold. And yet, this proximity gave birth to a strange anxiety in her. Some evenings, when she crossed her in the corridors, she had the impression of seeing a ghost again. This way of walking, the softness in the eyes, this slight bend on the forehead when she was focused, all this reminded her of something she did not yet dare to name. But the real turning point came one stormy evening. Ijeoma was working in her office, surrounded by files and bright screens. The rain was hitting the windows. In the distance, a voice rose, soft, pure. Chidinma was still humming this lullaby. This time, she did not content herself with listening to it from her office. She got up slowly, short breath, as if drawn despite herself. She walked, stumbling in the darkened corridor, guided by the melody. She found it in the kitchen, standing near the sink, her hands plunged into the foam, her eyes lost in the void, as if in a slight trance. The young woman did not even notice that we were watching her. The rain was falling hard outside, and the hot lighting of the room bathed the scene in a golden light. Ijeoma felt something crack in her. This song, these gestures, this serenity, all of this belonged to a past that she believed dead. "Chidinma," she said in a low voice. The young woman jumped up slightly and turned around, confused. "Yes, Madame, this song, you've known it forever?" She hesitated for a moment, then raised her head. "My mother sang it to me every night when I was little. She said it brought happiness." Ijeoma's heart lacked a beat. She wanted to answer, ask questions, but no word came out. She contented herself with staring at her for a moment before slowly turning around, her face empty of color. That night, she could not sleep. Lying in her huge bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, she saw motherhood again. She saw that little body that had been torn from her arms. She saw the nurse, Ngozi. And this song, the song that she had sung to her baby the first and only night they spent together. The next day, she said nothing to anyone. But she was watching, she was listening. Every word, every gesture of Chidinma became a clue. The governess, too, had noticed something strange. She confided to Grace one morning, "This girl, she's not like the others. It seems that she knows this house for a long time." Grace, who knew Ijeoma better than anyone else, rubbed her eyebrows. "Pay attention to what you say, madam. Does not like stories." But even she, deep down, felt this unusual presence. This girl was different. In the days that followed, Ijeoma surprised Chidinma in her office, sorting out files that she had never left untouched before. She wanted to reprimand her, but instead she remained silent, troubled by this confidence that she seemed to give her without realizing it. And it was then that for the first time in years, Ijeoma felt something strange. No power, no anger, but an attachment that she could not explain. An invisible bond seemed to be woven between them. And the more the days passed, the more this bond tightened. Gently, dangerously. Ijeoma's nights became more and more agitated. She, who had always slept with a rigid and silent sleep, now woke up in a hurry, short breath, as if someone had just stolen her air. And each time, without her knowing why, Chidinma appeared in her mind. One night, as she stood up in the dark, she saw a silhouette in the shadow of the corridor. It was just a housemaid passing by. But the image strangely reminded her of Ngozi's memory. The nurse, the one who had held her baby for the last time. The next few days, this strange impression became a silent obsession. She was watching Chidima without realizing it. She was looking for signs, for details that could reassure her, or indeed confirm that crazy thought that was rooted in her mind. One afternoon, as she was returning from an important meeting, the housemaid discreetly knocked on the door of her office. "Madame, I think you should see this." She was holding in her hand a small golden medallion, worn over time. "I found it in the young girl's suitcase, putting her things away. I think it's important." Ijeoma took the object in her trembling fingers. As she felt the cold metal in her palm, her heart froze. She did not need to open it to know. She knew this medallion. It was hers, the one she had left around the neck of her baby the day it had been taken from her. Inside were engraved her initials, IE, and a date, 12 May 2001. Her eyes were filled with tears that she tried to hold back. Her legs flared slightly. She slowly sat down in her armchair, her eyes fixed on the jewel as if it contained all her life. "Where did you find this?" she asked in a broken voice. "In these things, madame." For long minutes, she remained motionless, frozen between two times, the luxurious present that she had built and the past that she had tried to forget. This medallion, it could not have come into the hands of anyone. It was an invisible thread, a bridge between her and this missing child. She got up slowly and walked to the window of her office. Outside, the city of Abuja was expanding, powerful and alive. But at that precise moment, she had the impression that the ground was falling under her feet. She squeezed the medallion against her chest and closed her eyes. A murmur escaped her lips. "My God, is it possible?" That night, she did not sleep. She sat in her living room, alone, the medallion in her hand, fixing the empty walls around her. Each tick-tack of the clock reminded her of the lost time. The years passed without a stretch, without a word, without an explanation. And for the first time in a long time, Ijeoma felt his inner fortress crack. It was no longer a simple coincidence. It was no longer a vague impression. Something, or rather someone, was coming back into his life. From that night on, nothing was the same in Ijeoma's head. Every time Chidima entered a room, she felt her heart contracting, as if an invisible truth was floating in the air, ready to burst. She observed the young woman with a new attention, the way she laughed in a low voice when she joked with the cook, the way she arranged the blankets exactly as Ijeoma liked them, this little fold at the corner of her lips when she thought. Each detail seemed to whisper only one thing: "She is yours." But Ijeoma refused to be carried away by a simple premonition. She had built her life on control, not on illusions. She had to know, really know. One morning, she had Chidima called into her private office. The young woman arrived, her hands slightly trembling, intimidated by the solemnity of the place. Ijeoma's office was not a place where housewives easily entered. The large windows let in a cold light, and each piece of furniture seemed to impose silence. "Sit down," she said gently. Chidima obeyed, her eyes lowered. For a few seconds, Ijeoma did not speak. She just looked at her, as if she were trying to find in her features the blurry face of a newborn she had never forgotten. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. Then she asked the question calmly. "Tell me, Chidima, what was your mother's name?" Chidima raised her eyes, a little surprised. "Ngozi, Ngozi Okofo, madam." This name that Ijeoma had not heard for more than 20 years. She felt a burn in her chest, a wave that crossed her whole body. Ngozi, the nurse, the one who held her baby in her arms. She hid her trouble behind an impassive face. "And your father?" she asked in a controlled voice. "I never knew him," replied Chidima. "My mother said he was dead before my birth." Ijeoma felt his throat tighten. the father of this child. It was him too that she had lost too early. An accident, a tragedy. She continued, her voice a little lower. And this medallion, where did you get it? Chidima put his hand instinctively on his neck, where the little golden chain hung. She hesitated a moment before answering. This is the only memory my mother left me. She always told me that I had to keep it close to me because it belonged to the woman who had given birth to me. This sentence was like an electric discharge. Ijeoma turned her gaze away to hold back the tears that came to her eyes. She spent the whole day in a second state, between shock and lucidity. The pieces of this cruel puzzle clung to each other, and the more they aligned, the more the truth became obvious. But she needed an irrefutable proof. She discreetly called Grace in her office. I want you to help me organize a DNA test, she said in a firm tone. No one should know. Grace, confused, dared to ask, a DNA test? With who? Ijeoma fixed her in her eyes. With Chidima. The businesswoman's voice was calm, but her hands trembled slightly under the table. She knew that if the result confirmed what she prescient, nothing would be the same as before. The following days were unbearable. She tried to behave normally, to continue working, to give orders as usual, but each minute seemed suspended to this silent verdict. She watched Chidima pass through the corridors and felt a heat invade her chest. She wanted to hold her in her arms, but she held back. She wanted to scream her love, but she was silent. And finally, the day came. In a white envelope, cold and ordinary, was the answer to 23 years of pain. She opened it alone in her office, her hands trembling. Her eyes crossed the lines one by one until this sentence. Biological link, 99.9%. Mother-daughter relationship confirmed. Her breath was cut short. She slowly collapsed into her armchair, the envelope slipping from her fingers. The tears, this time, flowed freely, without her being able to hold them back. 23 years. 23 years of lack, of regrets, of murmured prayers in the silence of a large empty house. She never stopped hoping, even without admitting it. And now, this young woman she had welcomed into her house, whom she saw as a stranger, was her daughter. The sun had set on Abuja, enveloping the city in an orange glow. The villa of Ijeoma was bathed in a strange calm. The housewives were already in their rooms. The governess had finished her tour, and Grace had left the place for a long time. Ijeoma, she, had not moved for hours. Sitting in the large, silent living room, she held the result of the test between her fingers, as if it were a truth that one fears as much as one desires. The dimmed light of the lamps drew on her face the outlines of a tired woman, bewildered by her certainties. For 23 years, she had imagined this moment 1,000 times, in her prayers, in her dreams, in her deepest regrets. But she never imagined that it would happen like this, in her own house, by chance of fate. She took a long breath and called Chidima. The young woman came down a few minutes later, dressed in a simple t-shirt and a scarf tied around her waist. She had this quiet look that Ijeoma had learned to know, this sweetness in her eyes, this strange light that hurt her heart. "Did you call me, madame?" she asked respectfully. Ijeoma stayed a moment without answering. She fixed Chidima as if she wanted to engrave her face inside her. Then she whispered softly, almost out of breath, "Sit down." The young woman sat down carefully on the sofa opposite her. A long silence settled in between them, this kind of silence that says more than words. Ijeoma's eyes shone with an emotion that she was no longer trying to hide. "There is something I have to tell you," she began with a trembling voice. "Something I should have known for a long time." Chidima slightly brushed her eyebrows, not understanding very well. Ijeoma lowered her eyes on the sheet between her fingers. Then she slowly raised her head, and in her eyes there was no longer the hard and icy businesswoman. There was only the sea. "You are my daughter," she finally said, the broken voice. Chidima remained frozen. Her heart missed a beat. The words floated in the air for a few seconds, heavy, unreal, almost unbearable. But even before Ijeoma could continue, The young woman murmured in a calm, almost sad voice, "I know." Ijeoma jumped. "You what?" Chidinma looked her straight in the eyes. No surprise, no panic, only a deep, ancient pain. "I know you are my mother." The world seemed to stop around Ijeoma. The tick-tock of the clock disappeared. The silence became heavy like a leaden heart. "Since when?" she asked, her throat tied. "Always," Chidinma replied gently. "My mother, finally the one who raised me, told me everything before she died. She gave me your name. She told me the story." "And why didn't you say anything?" Ijeoma sighed on the brink of tears. "Because I wanted to see who you really were," she replied with a disarming sincerity. "I wanted to see if you had any remorse, or if you had just turned the page." Each word hit Ijeoma like a knife. She held her hand in her mouth to hold back a tear. "Chidinma, I never forgot you. Not a single night, not a single day." She got up, took a few hesitant steps towards her, then stretched out her arms with overwhelming shyness, like a mother who does not dare to touch what she loves most in the world. But Chidinma backed away slightly. "You abandoned me," she said with a trembling voice. "You chose your name, your family, your reputation instead of me." Ijeoma's breath stopped. She fell to her knees in front of her own daughter, unable to contain her tears. "I was looking for you, Chidinma. I was looking for you everywhere. I never stopped loving you. I lived with this void like a condemned woman." The young woman turned her eyes, overwhelmed by contradictory emotions, anger, pain, but also a tenderness that she could not deny. This silent scene in the living room was the face-to-face of two broken lives, that of a mother who had lost her child, and that of a girl who had grown up in the shadow of an abandonment. Ijeoma's tears were falling on the marble floor. Chidinma stood still, her face hard but her eyes wet. Neither of them knew how to put the pieces together, because deep down, neither of them had ever stopped looking for each other. The days that followed the revelation were of an unbearable heaviness in Ijeoma's villa. The air seemed colder, the corridors more silent, the eyes more fleeing. Chidinma avoided the main house as much as she could. She only briefly met Ijeoma during meals or in the corridor, and even those moments were to be crossed by a cutting silence. The wound was not new, but now she had a face, a truth. Ijeoma, she was no longer the same. The fearful businesswoman was hiding behind a broken woman, a mother late in her own story. She had tried hard to work. Her hands were shaking when she was signing documents. The meeting seemed meaningless to her. The numbers were no longer important. Every night, she sat on the terrace, alone, her eyes lost in the void. The hot wind of Abuja blew her face, but inside, everything was frozen. She repeated this sentence over and over again. If I had not given in to fear, she would never have grown far from me. She had spent 23 years dreaming to find her daughter. She finally had her in front of her, but the reality had a bitter taste. Lost time does not erase. One night, she found the door of Chidinma's room open. The suitcase was on the floor, open. The young woman quietly put her things away. "You're going?" asked Ijeoma, her voice broken. Chidinma jumped up slightly, then slowly hoisted her head. "I can't stay here, madame." "Don't call me madame," Ijeoma sighed. A long silence, then Chidinma looked away. "I've never had a mother, and now that I know, I don't even know how to pretend." These words struck Ijeoma in the heart. She moved forward as if to hold her back, but her hands remained suspended in the void. She was afraid to touch her, afraid to choke her, afraid to lose her for good. Chidinma closed her suitcase and left the house before dawn, without a word more. The servant watched her pass by, her face closed, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let flow. When Ijeoma descended to the living room that morning, the house seemed bigger to her than ever. The medallion she had dropped the day before was hanging on the lower table. She picked it up slowly, pressed it against her chest, and collapsed in the armchair in tears. The press began to talk about her prolonged absence from work. They murmured that she was sick. Others said she was preparing for retirement. But in truth, she was only doing one thing, waiting. She no longer had the strength to build, to lead, to play her role. She had become a mother again who had lost, a second time. The weeks passed like this, heavy and slow. Then one stormy evening, while she was sitting on the terrace, a discreet noise caught her attention. The grate had just opened. A silhouette was slowly advancing under the rain. It was her, Chidinma. She didn't have a suitcase this time, only her medallion around her neck and this expression in her eyes, a mixture of pain, tenderness, and decision. Ijeoma got up, her heart beating so fast that she was in pain. Neither of them spoke. They stayed there, under the thin rain, a few meters away from each other. Two women bound by blood, but separated by 23 years of silence.
And then, slowly, Chidinma moved forward. Her steps resonated on the wet ground like a melody that only a mother could hear. Ijeoma didn't dare move. She was afraid that all this was just a dream, but when Chidinma arrived in front of her, she slowly raised her arms, and this time the young woman didn't move back. She let herself be enveloped in a trembling, disordered but real constriction. They stayed like this for a long time, without a word, letting the rain fall on their faces, mingled with tears. No word could erase the past, but this constriction said everything that the years had stolen. That night, in the big villa in Abuja, there was no power, no fortune, no contract, only a mother and her daughter. Two heartbroken people who, in spite of everything, had just reunited.